couple of issues. There are, in the details of the text, they're kind of complicated to sort out. In philosophics, just straightforward philosophical terms, which are the ones that we're most interested in, they're actually not that hard. It's just, you have to kind of get your mind around it and not get caught up in too many of the details. So, we have a soul with appetite, spirit, and reason. And we've got, these are, well, not good relative. These are part good relative. And these are whole good relative. So that's the first thing to say. And now we want to talk about an aspect of their interrelation, right? And the interrelation is one that Plato talks, because he takes it in part from his analogy with the city. He talks in terms of rule, of one part ruling the other. So rule is a very handy way to think about the interrelation. That's what we'll call psychic rule. That's this. And now here's I'm going to give you the example. We didn't read this passage, but you can look at it if you want. It's in Book 8, in which Plato is describing what he calls the oligarchic man. That is, somebody in whose soul there is a rule that's rather like the rule of oligarchy in a city. And the only thing, we don't need to go into any of the details, we just need to get the picture. He's very vivid there. He says, the oligarchic person has appetitive desires of a certain sort. These are the ones that we've already met, the necessary ones, the ones that it's good to have, or that aren't harmful, or that you can moderate in some way. Right? So he's an appetitive person, but he's not out of control. He's moderated those appetites. As Plato will say, he's become a money lover because he sees that money is the best way to satisfy all his appetites. And in that sense, he's able to postpone gratification, say, in order to be better able to satisfy his appetites in the long term. So he's quite different from somebody who just acts on whatever appetite happens to be in place, right? He can say no to this one now because he sees that he'll better be able to satisfy it later. So he says, this is what he says about the oligarch. He says, spirit and reason, so these two parts of the soul, he makes those sit at his feet below appetite and won't let reason do anything except calculate how little money can be made into much. And he won't allow his spiritual desires to do anything except admire money lovers and rich people. So think about it this way, right? Depending, your psychic rule, the rule of any one of these is to be understood this way. It determines what the good is that you're going to go for, right? So when appetite rules, it says, my values are the true ones, you get behind them, right? So, you know, don't worry about anything except making a lot of money, and don't admire anybody except people who are very good at it. That's it. I don't want reason doing anything else. Don't waste your time on any other stuff. Just do this, right? So psychic rule has this picture. So let's take the rule of appetite as our example of psychic rule. And then what's true is that the good aimed at is appetitive good. Right? So that's easy. I mean, you sort of get it, right? You're an appetitive person when appetite determines your central major goals, and the whole structure of your soul reflects that, right? So who you admire, what you allow reason to think about or operate on is all determined by your appetites. So the kind of question you ask, when someone says, hey, you know, I think Frank is a really great guy, you say, oh yeah, how rich is he? right? How much does he earn? That's it, of course, as we know, we live in a world that's very much like that, right? But he's supposed to be great. Look how wealthy he is, right? And then the other one is, so that's the kind of admiration side. And then the other is, so imagine, what courses am I going to take? Well, which ones will get me a really high-paying job? Because that's all I care about. And you select, right? And notice that when you do that, you're signing on to developing your cognitive capacities along money-making lines. You're not going to develop them along other lines, right? You're only going to, so it's kind of self-perpetuating, right? You never get the information that would put you on different, right? Because you have already committed yourself, so to speak, in a certain way. So that's what psychic rule is. And that means that that's the goal-oriented part of it. And then the thought is that, relative to it, if spirit tries to admire, so to speak, somebody who isn't competitive, appetite comes in and says, don't be stupid, right? Look, he laid down his life for his friend, but now he's dead. No, that's not a good way to make money, right? Where is he now? That's useless, right? And so that'll be the kind of line, and we know we hear it a lot, right? Well, that's just empty nonsense. Don't waste your time on that. What good is that? How are you going to make any money out of that? Those are the kinds of questions. Okay. So now let's look. So you see what goes on when this happens, right? When appetite rules spirit and reason, their goals are subordinated to this. And that means that spirit doesn't get to admire, if you like, what's truly admirable. It gets to admire what appetite says is admirable. And it doesn't get to calculate about things that are worth calculating about. It gets to calculate about things that appetite says are worth calculating. And since appetite has not, if you're an appetitive person, you take only courses that help you satisfy your appetite. Would you close your account? Yeah, thanks. You're probably not looking at it, but it could be fascinating material that's much better than this, right? It says to reason, right? Well, you're only to calculate and work on things that are going to help us make money, help you make money, so that if, for example, now we'll put it in this way, you decide you're going to take an English course on romantic poets, and the appetite says, it could be your parent, a parent who says, what are you wasting your time on that stuff for? Well, that's not going to help you get a job. Why don't you take Econ 293, right? How to make money easily. Right? That's the course I want you to take. Okay. So you with me? Right? There are two parts, right? What's my goal? That depends on rule. But also, what will happen if I try to go against this? Then, right, if appetite is strong, will just push me to go in the right direction. Right? So it's got an executive and a sort of legislative side to it. Okay. Now let's look at what happens when reason rules. So this is the good case for Plato, right? And you can already see that it's got to be the good one, right? Why? Well, look. It's the only one that's whole good relative. The others are all partial glimpses of the good. They don't get the whole picture. So needless to say, if you follow partial stories about what's really good for you, you're going to do much less well than if you get it right. So the thought is, so think about it this way. Think about reason as engaging in happiness studies. Not in how to make a lot of money, not in how to win fame and glory, but in what will make you happy. So reason does a whole big lot. If you let it alone, so to speak, and you don't bully it into doing something else, reason will do happiness studies, right? It'll study the good, where the good is, well, what, when you embody it, will result in you being happy, right? So, okay, that's what reason's going to do. Well, now it stands to reason, right, that you're better off following reason if what you want to do is get to be happy. Yeah. So, right, this one studies money making. This one studies fame. And this one studies happiness. So this one says, essentially, don't go for happiness unless it will make you famous. And the other one says, don't go for happiness unless it will make you rich. And both of those are really stupid, right? After all, you're not going for money because you think money is the name of the game. You're going for money because you think money will make you happy. And you're wrong about that. A certain amount of it, yes, but after that, no. Right? Plenty of evidence in support of that. Okay, so that's the thought. So now you see why you want reason to rule. And now now we have to ask this question, right? So what does it study when it studies happiness? So what are happiness studies? So, you know, we don't have a department of happiness in the university. It's too bad, obviously, only idiots would fail to major in that, right? Come on, what are you majoring in? Misery. Right? That's pretty easy, you'll probably do well with that. Math? Is it part of the happiness studies program? If it is, I'm doing it. If it's not, of course I'm not going to do it. That would be ridiculous, right? I don't want to know the truth just for the sake of knowing the truth. I mean, think of all the truths that are not worth knowing, right? Like, how many hairs have you got on your head? Well, you can find that out, right? It's easier for some than for others. Right? You can find that out, right? But who cares, right? How many bacteria how many little goo-eating creatures are living in your eyelashes? We know we've got them, we go blind without them. How many are there? Who cares? Right? And then go on with, you know, there are hundreds and there are uncountably many things that are not worth knowing. I'm guessing. But I'm pretty sure I'm right about that. Okay, so anyway, there's a lot. So, like, we want to know the things, the knowledge of which will contribute to our happiness. And so, of course, we want to do happiness studies. The only question is, what are they? Right? So that's where some of the interest is. Right? So Plato makes a few moves that are, I think, we'll see them. They become perennially attractive. They're tweaked and kind of resituated, but they remain the name of the game. Right? Even for Kant, who thinks it's not about happiness studies, Kant thinks, no, it's about justice studies. You ought to be taking courses called the right, not courses called the good. You should be studying duty, right? Not happiness, right? You should be grim, not smiling, right? Go for the grim, right? That's the stuff. But even he's going to buy this picture. He's not going to buy that what you're studying is happiness, but he's going to agree that you're studying the very same thing. Because when he tells you what it is to go for duty, he's going to tell you about rational order and structure, which is just what Plato thinks the good stands on. So for Plato, so a big part of a lot of the work I've done on both Kant and on both Plato and Aristotle is to show in a subtle way how Kantian they are, or rather, as I would put it, how Platonic and Aristotelian Kant is. So for one reason, I just think the contrast is a hopeless one, right? You can't actually get Kant to tell you a coherent story that isn't along Platonic and Aristotelian lines, but that's downstream. We're going to get to Kant. Okay, so what are happiness studies? And on Plato's view, they're studies of rational order. That's my term for what Plato thinks the good is. I think the good is a principle of rational order. So if you've got a, so just think for a moment this way. So what's a good corkscrew? Right, take a humdrum case, or a good mousetrap, or a good chair, or a good anything fairly straightforward. And Plato thinks it's going to be a matter of its structure. And when its structure is right, when it's got the right structural elements, then it's going to be a good one. You're going to be a good person if your soul is ordered so that reason rules it. That's a structural aspect of your soul that's present in a city when the embodiments of reason, the rulers, the celestial kings and queens, right, they rule. Then, and the spirited ones side with them or carry out their orders, and the appetitive ones moderate their appetites, right? When all of that's in place, you've got the same structure present in both. And that structure is what makes both of them just. Right? So studies of rational order are studies of structure. Right? All of these are, to some degree, metaphors. That is, they only get their life and really get filled out when you see what structure means in particular. Right? So, for example, when we study algebraic geometry, Cartesian geometry, just the algebraic form of geometry, we start to see structures in spatial arrangements that are just like structures in non-spatial arrangements. So mathematics is extraordinarily good at telling you that these structures are just special cases of those structures, which are just special cases of these other structures, helping you to see deeper and deeper into structure. But it's when you do it, then you think, I'm not just using a word structure without any content. Now I can tell you what I mean by structure. Let me give a different example. How many of you have taken a logic course? Yeah. So when you study logic, you study a certain kind of rational order. Here's an example. Modus ponens, right? P, P-R-O-Q, Q. That's a valid inference rule. Well, what makes it valid? What makes it a good inference rule? It's a good one, and now you can tell somebody something about logical structure. One kind of good logical structure is that one. Here's another. Both P and not P. Is that a good example of good logical structure? No. Why? Well, it's from P and not P. I can prove everything. Right? So you know the proof, right? It's very simple. They're kind of handy. So we've got P and not P. So by simplification, we've got P, right? Yes. Then we've got P or Q by disjunction. Then we've got not P by simplification. Then we've got Q for any Q. Right? So give me a contradiction and I can prove anything from you. When I was a TA for logic in graduate school, I had a student, a graduate student, unfortunately, who utilized this rule. But only after he'd done a whole big load of other stuff. So somewhere down in the middle of a great long string of premises and other things would appear this rule. And so when I gave him a 0 on his final exam, I was generous. There were negative grades. You could get minus grades. Well, I gave him a 0. And I told him that his proofs were too long. And he said, "Do you mean you flunked me just because my proofs were too long?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely. Look, you had this rule. It was very simple. You could do a good thing." And he didn't see what was wrong with it. He thought, "Oh my God, that's a great rule. Jeez." He probably sells insurance now. Okay, so that's a good example of logical structure, right? Not both P and not P. Contradictions can't be true, right? Modus ponens is a good principle of logical structure. And when you're studying propositional logic, right, you're studying a certain segment of logical space, and you're looking at the structural principles that apply in it. And so when you're asked what's logical structure, you can say, oh, I can tell you some examples. Right? So I'm telling you some things about it that help you to see that it's not just a metaphor. Right? So now so that's the thought. Now let's take another example from a different area altogether. So let's suppose that you're learning how to play the piano, and the first big load of stuff is kind of practical. You know, you're learning to play little tunes and some scales and stuff like that. And then you are introduced to music theory. And in music theory, you start studying musical structure. The structure of scales, the structure of larger pieces of music, sonata form. These are structural, right? And in fact, they're mathematizable. You can actually see those structures in mathematical terms. This is music that we're talking about, right? So what you then see is that, right, what a musical rational structure is. Harmony, right? You're studying the structural basis of harmonic scales, right? And that shows you that there's a kind of structure to the world of sound that you didn't see before you learned all those really interesting, cool stuff about it. Let's take a very different example altogether. We'll look at the, so far, right, you've got logic, right, we've got that as an example. Music. Now let's look at painting. Now this could be surprising, but I don't know if any of you know, what is that film called about Vermeer? Who's somebody's Vermeer. What is his name?
How to paint Vermeer.
Yeah, no, that's not. No, it's called Frank's Vermeer or something like this. So this is about a computer guy who looks at some famous Vermeer paintings. Now, what's really surprising about Vermeer paintings is the level of the geometry of. So, for example, he paints a spinner or like a piano-like thing, and along it there's a frieze, right? And the piano curves, right? So he has to paint the frieze, right, with tiny little figures. He has to paint it so that it gets the curvature right. It's extremely difficult to do this. Geometric optics, right, tells you it was a very hard problem to solve. And Vermeer does it perfectly. And so what this guy does is he sets out to paint a Vermeer. He sets out himself to paint that Vermeer. And the way he does it is by using computer models and mathematical breakdowns. He discovers that there's a way to use mirrors and lenses to cast what's in front of you onto a flat screen, so that then you just each fill in the little piece with your brush on the screen, following the rules of optics, and you get a. Of course, it's not quite Vermeer, but it's so close that you see that, as he says, this is how Vermeer must have done it. He painted it by using a mirror and a lens to cast little pieces of what was in front of him onto the canvas so that he could then fill it out with his brush. Brilliant film, by the way. I mean, it's really worth taking a look at. So what do we see? Well, we see that in this kind of representational painting, right, the underlying structure is that of mathematical optics, right? So when we do the same when Descartes studied vision, Descartes, the inventor of Cartesian geometry and the one who said cogito ergo sum, that one, Descartes studied geometrical optics and discovered a whole lot of the fundamental geometrical laws of optics, which are about lens curvatures and light bending. I don't know if you ever studied light and magnetism, but you know, you have a lens curved like this, a light ray comes in, it bends down. So in my correctional lenses, if you've got them, this is what happens. Light rays come in and then they get concentrated or bent by the curvature of the lens, so that the image that forms on your retina is a correct one, better than the one that would form if you took your glasses off, right? How does all that work? Well, it all works according to these kinds of structural principles that are essentially mathematizable. We could go on, right? When physics discovers fundamental laws and expresses them in mathematical terms, right? So famously, E is equal to mc squared, or P times Q approximates to H, or any one of those basic fundamental laws, we see that they're exposing the mathematical structure of reality around us. And so the Pythagoreans, the ones of Pythagoras' theorem, the Pythagoreans said the fundamental building blocks of the universe are numbers. And while Plato, Aristotle makes fun of them, because he says, gee, I thought things had mass, but numbers don't. I thought, he goes, I thought things can move, but numbers can't. I mean, it makes a whole lot of really hard-hitting points, but at the same time, he sees what they're trying to say, because for them, a number is not an abstract object, it's the least unit. It's a least unit, and so you build everything up out of units. That's the idea. So far, so good. So Plato looks at, especially, the most developed science in ancient Greece was geometry. Very developed. So, you can take that. And what did it say over the door of the academy? Plato's school? I told you. But you forgot. I'll tell you again. Right? Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. That would take care of a big part of the college-age population, right? So Euclid's geometry, if you've never taken a look at it, you should. You can Google it, and you can see it for free right there in electronic space. You can see it, and you can see how sophisticated it is. Incredibly sophisticated. So that if you're studying it in high school, as I have to be, right, you realize that to do these theorems, to prove these things, extremely difficult. Some are easy, some are immensely difficult. Okay? So Plato's looking at this. He's surrounded by mathematicians, the best in Greece come to the academy to study. They're doing astronomy. Take another example. The order of the stars and planets, the regularity with which they move. So you find Plato in Book 7 of the Republic saying, listen, the way to study astronomy, is not to lie on your back and look up at the sky. That stuff up there is just a model of the geometrical structure that actually is doing theoretical geometry. What you really want to be doing is what Eudoxus did. Eudoxus worked out a mathematical model to explain the movements of the planets and the stars and everything. Right? There's actually, if you Google Eudoxus, if you Google this guy, you can actually see a computer simulation of his system. You can see how, when you set it all in motion, you can actually see the planets all moving according to Eudoxus's rather complicated rules. So think about that. Plato looks at it all and he says, happiness studies has got to be a branch of mathematics. It's got to be the study of a certain kind of order, which if you embody it, will result in you being happy. Here's a sort of schematic for what you'll discover. If your psyche is ruled by your reason, which is in turn informed by these studies of what actually makes human life good, then you have the best chance of being happy, especially if that whole knowledge is embodied in a social system that produces people who follow it and then is ruled by people who go for that. So I'll add one more, you can do this. Economics. That takes care of a big part. So if you study not just kind of the sort of elementary economics that mostly learn in first undergraduate economics classes, but if you look at the sort of what I think of as serious economics that looks not just at mathematical structures, but also looks at issues in theoretical biology and how they operate, then you realize just how sophisticated a mathematical system can be, even when dealing with apparently in, chaotic things, right? You can really get an incredible amount of insight from the mathematics. Theoretical biology is another example of this. The more we know about the structure of things like DNA and so on, the more we recognize that mathematics is in part a key to life systems and other things as well. So Plato gets a small fragment of this. He's got logic, hasn't quite been formalized yet, it won't be till Aristotle comes along and does it in the prior analytics. Music, very sophisticated. The Pythagoreans have already worked out the mathematics of many of the scales. Painting, well, they've already got illusionistic painting. Plato refers to it, right? We could add another one, architecture. Oh, what have we got in Athens? What does Plato see every day? The Parthenon, right? You never looked at it, but it's well worth taking a look at. But it's not just that the Parthenon is one of the greatest buildings ever built. It's still a great building. Thucydides says that Athens was so great a city that even in ruins it was great. It is in ruins, and there it is. It's still great. It's the mathematics of the Parthenon. The Parthenon is an incredibly sophisticated mathematical structure. So let me give you a little bit of the flavor of it. So it's got a long, flat base, and on it are columns like this. Just stick with that much. If you make these columns, these lines parallel, by the way, fluting columns, they're all fluted. They have little indentation. You know what fluting is. Well, I don't know another good word for fluting. They're fluted. So if you make the sides parallel, from a distance they will look like this. The bow in, right? So you've made something perfectly rectangular, right? But it won't look that way. It will look like this. In the same way, if you make this perfectly flat, it will look like this, right? Because things at the ends will look lower than things in the middle, and the overall effect will be to produce this. So now think about that. The Parthenon doesn't look that way. It looks right. That's because all these columns are actually, in reality, they're actually bowed out like that. They're actually fatter in the middle than they are at the top. So they correct for the inner. So they look this way, they're actually this way. The bottom was not flat, that's actually curved to allow to get the whole thing right. So, and the same is true for the pedimental statues, the so-called Elgin marbles that are in the British Museum. All of those things take into account not just the geometry, the plain geometry of Parthenon, but the psychology, or rather I should say, the geometry of optics, of vision. And they correct reality, right? This is the way to look at it. So that what appears to be so will look right, even though what's actually there will not be as it appears, right? So that's a very sophisticated piece of thinking. Plato saw it every day. There it is, right? An amazing piece of architecture, building, everything. It's right up on top of a really big hill. All the marble had to be carted up there. You wonder how they ever did it. It's an amazing sight to go even in ruins. And again, it's online. You can go on a tour of the Parthenon without even leaving your dorm room. You just click on it, and then you can go around and look at it from every conceivable angle and hear more about every little brick that's up there than you ever wanted to know, right? So all of these resources are available. Okay, so Plato looks at all of this. He notices a whole lot of things. Architectural beauty, which I've just been describing, is a complex mathematical structure. It has to do with the geometry of shapes, but also the geometry of optics. He sees that, that good arguments have a certain kind of logical structure. It's the structure that makes them good. He sees that in music, harmony, a value term, is determined by a structural feature. He sees that accuracy and pleasingness in painting is in part a result of mathematical structure. Geometry, obvious. Astronomy, obvious. And so on. Right? So he says, okay, so that's what you need to be studying in order to figure out what happiness is. Right? And we do very similar if we were studying Mill. Right, we'd see that Mill tries to do essentially the same thing. He thinks, what are the units, and Plato you will see doing this on Wednesday, what are the units of happiness? Well, they're units of pleasure. What are units of pleasure? Well, it's not quite so simple because there are different kinds of pleasure, but some units, small units of one pleasure are more pleasant than big units of another one. We've got a whole lot of little, but notice it's all mathematics. And then it starts to be this way, welfare economics, which is the economics of happiness, comes along and says, okay, so it's about how to distribute utility. What's utility? It's pleasure minus pain, roughly. And what I want to do is maximize that for everybody. Notice how structural, mathematical, and so forth all of that is. How much like reason it kind of can start, or mathematics it can start to look. Okay, so that's what happiness studies is. And that's why in book 6, you get these glorious images of the sunrise and caves, sort of getting you to see what, from one point of view, what all this order and structure is like. And then in book 7, right, you hear that the guardians, the rulers, have to study all of this logic, right? They've got to do an incredible amount of mathematics. They've got to do what Plato calls dialectic, which is taking all these sciences and trying to put them all together in some synoptic vision of all of this. And they don't come out of all of that till they're 55. And then they actually have, there's some reason to believe that they actually do know, excuse me, how to make people happy. Then you put them to rule, and what do you get? Oh, you get a lot of happy people, you know? What do you expect? Right? That's the goal. Right? Now you see why it looks the way it does, right? It's, we get a first pass at it by noticing that we've got these different elements in our psyche, and we've got a theory of them that explains that they're different because of the different ways they're related to the good. We see that that's got, if you like, psychological legs. We can get it. Doesn't seem arbitrary. Then we shift away to what would be required for this thing to do the ruling, and then we are led to think, well, it better engage in happiness studies. Then we're asked, what are the happiness studies? What's the good for human beings and things that we are studying? Some kind of rational order. What's the evidence for that? It comes from over here. Let's develop that idea, and then we're going to get a picture like this, right? Ethics, the study of what promotes of happiness and what promotes it, is in fact a kind of study of rational order. So it's a kind of mathematics. Right, and that notion that ethics and reason are tightly connected, that when we bore into it, so to speak, to be good is to be rational. That keeps on the firmament of ethics nearly, well, still, right? That's a big step. And it's very easy to finesse two things, right? One is to think that this question, so when and Plato raises it in the Philebus, so a very late dialogue, that's now a simple one. But he asks a key question, which of course is a brilliant question, right? He looks at his own theory, and he says there's an unanswered question. And this unanswered question will turn out to be itself a nightmare of a question for people to answer. So, is the rational order happiness because it's rational order? Or is it happiness because it's pleasant? So is it so let me give you the feel for it this way. Suppose I put the right rational order in your soul. So now you're rightly ordered, right? So you're just, you've got a just soul. Now, is that happiness because of you're having that rational order? Or is it happiness because it feels good? Because it's pleasant to have that rational order. Pleasure is the real kicker. So Plato says in the Philetus, look, something can't be happiness just because it's pleasant, because, well, there are bad pleasures, and there are disorderly pleasures, and there are pleasures that ruin your life and that aren't good for you, right? But it can't be rational order either. Why? Well, because nobody would go for rational order if it wasn't pleasant. That, in a way, is precisely what leads Kant to say, Judy, it's the rational order. And that's what leaves him with an insufferable problem, the Philetus problem. So who gives a, who cares about, who cares about rational order? What we want is a good, pleasant, joyful life, one that we like. You know, so what if we imagine then we're sort of all like this, right? This is the nightmare of the kind of Teutonic state, right? We've all got this perfect order. There's perfect order in society. Everything is perfectly ordered. It all looks geometrical. You know, that's all cool. And everybody is miserable, right? Nobody can get up in the morning, right? Why? Well, it's so boring. It's so unfun. There's no pleasure in anything anymore. Oh yeah, it's perfectly intelligible, beautifully structured, awfully mathematical, all of those things, but damn, that's so awful. Why isn't that possible? What excludes it? So next, on Wednesday, we're going to study Plato's view of pleasure. This is the kicker. This is what he finally says. Now I'm going to give you the proofs, now that I've told you what the just person is. Now I'm going to give you 3 proofs that the just person is happiest, and the next most just, the next happiest, all the way down to the tyrant who's the most miserable. How are we going to do that? He says the third and biggest overthrow, the really serious argument, is about pleasure. And he's going to tell you a story about pleasure that tries to convince you of this issue. So all the action, think about it again. So I'm motivated if I've got reasonable, the thought is, anybody can see, so to speak, that what I ought to go for in life is my happiness. Boom, 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 the story goes along. Yeah, singing that happy song, great. Okay, we're still going for happiness. Then we say, oh, happiness and rational order are connected together in some very deep and intrinsic way. Cool, cool, I'm into the math now, because I'm still into happiness, you see, and I know about the math that's going to conduce to my happiness. Then I ask myself this question, the very one that Philetus asks. What do is all that structure, when I've got it, now I've got it, is there something else I need for it to be happiness? Do I also have to enjoy having it? If I also have to enjoy happiness, then the logical structure is not what happiness is. Because you could have that without the pleasure, and then you wouldn't be happy. And if it is happiness, that's impossible, right? So that's where the issue is going to go, and then Kant is going to bite that, right? And so, as you know, when somebody bites the bullet, you should pull the trigger. With the gun, you know you have, because, well, you're an American, right? We all have guns. You saw about the killing, and so I like, really like this. It isn't people. It isn't guns that kill people. It's people. It isn't, and you think, but people without guns don't shoot people, right? So I mean, it's true. The guns don't wander around blowing people's brains out, but people don't wander around blowing people's brains out if they don't have any guns either. Okay. So Kant bites the bullet, and we pull the trigger, right? We say, why would I go for that Emmanuel. And what we'll see, right? And we should give them what in philosophy we call the incredulous stare. Like, you want us to go for that? Come on, right? And then what you discover is that Kant already knows that. He knows that that can't be enough. He knows that that can't be the end of the story, because if it is, the incredulous stare is exactly the right thing to give him. And you should close the book and go do your happiness studies somewhere else, because Kant has just bottomed out on this. So what he tells you is, reason also needs ground for hope. Because, right, now think about why you'd need hope. I see, so the thought is justice and all that stuff's not quite enough, right? In addition, you need not just hope, but rational hope. So Kant loves to put rational in front of problems and get them solved. Right? What else is this? It's not that. No, it's rational. Oh, that, okay. We'll see him do it. Don't worry. I'm not making it. I mean, he's a great philosopher, but you know, even great philosophers can be deceived. They can take themselves in, right? What he says, though, is, right, yes, but in a supersensible kingdom, you with me, heaven, ruled by a benevolent and omniscient ruler, God, justice and happiness will join. Right? And so, that's the basis for hope. The basis for hope is that one day, evil will not flourish like the great bay tree, but actually be consumed by hellfire, while we, the just, will be now at last enjoying happiness. But notice what Kant has done, right? He's tried to have it both ways, right? Why? Well, now somebody has to give you the joy. It's an add-on. It's not part of being just. It's something that a good ruler would add, like vitamins in your milk, right? It's not in there, it gets put in, and now there's a question of the Philebus again. Why do you have to put in pleasure in order to make this thing worth going for? Why is pleasure the reward? Why isn't it something else? And I don't think there's a good answer to that question. So I'm giving you a foretaste of what is to come, but you can see that it's already here, right? Yeah.
I mean, isn't Plato kind of doing the same thing? Because I think in his picture, even though we haven't got a complete picture yet, he's saying that in order for you to be happy, you need, like, the happiness study is about you, your own psychic, and also the structure of a just society. So, but you do have a kind of, like, you're skeptic towards whether the society is going to be just. And if it's an unjust society, and your rules will be very different for your own psychic, so you do have to...
Yeah, so at the end of book 7, right, Plato says, well, look, no, I think it's the end of 9. Plato says this, yeah, look, I mean, it's better for you to have a just soul, whatever society you're in. But if you're not in a just society, then you should lead a quiet life, because if they find you, they'll kill you. Right? So the thought is there. You need a match between the two to get the full deal. But the best part of it, though, is still that internally you're happy. But notice there is a difference between what Plato tries to do and what Kant. I mean, I don't know that Plato succeeds, but he certainly sees what it is he has to do. He's got to show that pleasure is intrinsic to happiness. He's got to show that, not that rational structure and pleasure are two different things, and that you can have one without the other. He's got to show that part of having the rational structure is the pleasure. And we'll see that Aristotle sees that this is the key issue, and then tries to show it to you too. But you see the question, right? If there are two targets, right, and I have to get both of them in order to be happy, there's going to be a question of which is doing the happiness work, this one or this one. So if I make it rational structure that's not doing the work, then it's just this. Rational structure is just a means to happiness. It's an extrinsically valuable thing that promotes pleasure, And therefore, you're just a consequentialist of that sort. You just think, well, the only reason I have all this rational structure is because it brings pleasure, which is what happiness is. If you go the other route, you end up being Kant, right? You say, no, it's somehow there's a different value, not happiness or pleasure, but justice or rightness that you get. And then, by a miracle, in a super-sensible kingdom ruled by, well, a divine philosopher king, you get what Plato thinks you can get on Earth if you just get your social engineering right. So Kant is a pessimist, right? He thinks, he's a Christian pessimist. He thinks it can't be that on Earth, which is a vale of tears and a place of testing, that we could make heaven. We need heaven for heaven. That's a view that we're not in a position to arrange our own welfare. We need a miracle. Plato thinks, no, you don't need a miracle. You just need happiness studies and a putting together of happiness studies with political power, and then you can get heaven on earth. Is it easy? No, it's not easy. But it's not impossible. Right? You don't have to just give up and say, oh man, we're here to suffer, so let's get on with it. Right? Okay. Any questions about that? You sort of see it, right? Really, all philosophy is just about getting these pictures. It looks like there's some magical game going on that's so obscure nobody could possibly understand it. But it's not that way. It looks that way, but if you bore into it and keep pushing, suddenly you start to see that really it's all really kind of simple. In essence, right, the anatomy of it, so to speak, the skeletal bone structure is actually pretty straightforward. So if somebody said to you, what's Plato's Republic about now? Right? You could actually give them a good, couldn't you? Give them a good story about it. A story about why it looks this way, why it's, you know, what he does to solve the Thrasymacheian challenge. Here's what he does. He says, look, absolutely. A lot of political power is about brainwashing people and controlling them. But when the brainwashing and the controlling, to keep calling it that, actually promotes your welfare, you don't really have much grounds for complaint about it. If the best you can do is to have such a level of understanding as your own IQ, etc., makes possible, and that's an understanding that promotes your welfare, you can't complain that, you know, you need a better one. You got the best one you can possibly have. Somebody else has got a better one, and they're arranging things nicely for you like a good parent, like your Heavenly Father will do on Kant's story. Yeah.
Okay, so one who knows like the pleasure derived from having a rational structure, the soul, that kind of thing. I mean, seeing the analogy of the cave or whatever.
Yeah.
We see that people want to spread this sort of truth they discovered. Why would they want to do that if they live in an unjust society? Or would they want to do that?
Well, they won't. So Plato says, look, if you've got an unjust, so he says this, right? The only society in which a philosopher would agree to rule is one in which he gets to make a clean start. So he says, throw out all the over 10s. That seems, the Jesuits think the over 5s. So, when should you start? Well, early, right? So, you know, the earlier the better, right? And so you might be that you think, okay, so we've got to have a clean slate to do this. And that's a very strong requirement, right? That says that, you know, in order to get your system going, you're not going to be able to impose it on an already